this computer. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back one more time. This is video number 5 that Mike Sullivan and I have been doing in response to Doug Wilson, who recently produced a video, pardon me, claiming that covenant eschatology, the full preterist view, is basically the worst sort of heresy one can imagine. And as Mike and I have pondered, we really don't know why he bothers with us, since there are only 14 of us full preterists around anyway. But, but nonetheless, he felt compelled to produce at least 2 videos attacking the full preterist view. So it is what it is. And so since Doug was one of the co-signers of a major letter sent out, signed by, I don't even know how many people have signed it now, all of whom were condemning Gary DeMar and all other people that would even think about studying covenant eschatology as heresy. I mean, it's just like, we're going to tell you what to think. We're going to tell you what to study. You're forbidden. You're forbidden to examine this doctrine. I can't help but think, Mike, years and years ago, right here in Ardmore, Oklahoma, when the controversy at the Maxwell Avenue Church of Christ was swirling, and I had 3 elders standing around me, not in the friendliest way, I might add, but there was a fella there that I had personally baptized. He was fully bought into covenant eschatology, thought it was just absolutely the most fantastic thing he had ever studied in his life. And he's there, and one of the person was standing there. And, you know, for the most part, the conversation was cordial, but more than a little tense at the same time. And the elders had drafted a letter to be read from the pulpit that the study of eschatology was forbidden by members of that congregation. And those of us standing around were discussing that letter. And I had told him, I said, brethren, you don't have the right to draft a letter like that. I'm sorry, you don't have that authority. One of the elders, who had a Napoleonic concept about himself, attitude, he said, well, we most assuredly do. We're the elders of this congregation. I said, that doesn't give you the right to dictate what people can study from their own Bible in their own home. And he said, of course it does. This fellow standing there that I had brought to the Lord, he was a policeman. He was a little outspoken. And he goes, pointing his finger at the elder, and he was a rather imposing guy. He said, let me tell you something. I came out of the Roman Catholic Church, where they tell us what we can think, when we can think it, how we can think it, what we can study, what we cannot study. And he said, I left that church because of that. And he said, guess what? I can leave this one too. And this elder speaks up and said, no, you can't. Good grief. And so I couldn't help but be reminded, as I read this letter, of that situation at the Maxwell Avenue Church of Christ, of men who seem to think they can dictate to other believers that they can't even pick up their own Bible in the privacy of their own home and just study whatever they want to.
Well, you can see, kind of from my perspective, the Reformed community, or the Sovereign Grace community, that they're torn, that they're giving 2 different messages. On the one hand, full preterism is so easy to refute.
Right.
Don, all you have to do is just look outside.
Look outside.
It's that simple to refute. On the other side, they are so threatened that you study this position, because it will make so much sense and it will connect so many dots for you. And they know that.
They know it.
They don't want you coming to them asking the important questions. Therefore, they forbid you to study this, and they will intimidate you and do whatever it takes. So I just find it interesting. On the one hand, you can't study it. Because it's so threatening, and then on the other hand, it's so easy to refute. So, in my community, it's like, oh, yeah, you want to study Arminianism and Calvinism? Go ahead. Because they're confident that if you look at both sides, they're confident that you'll come out more Calvinistic or whatever. But when it comes to preterism, it is so different. They are
Yeah.
so scared to death that you will study this. And it to me, I think like your friend there, I mean, it really just gives the farm away as far as what's really going on in the heart
Well,
and the mind.
there's something directly analogous to the illustration that you gave. In the churches of Christ historically, uh, prominent ministers in the Church of Christ would debate each other for the privilege of debating against dispensationalism. No, let me do it. Let me do it. No, let me do it. Well, when it comes to preterism, it's like, no, we're not going to debate. We're not going to debate that. We're not going to give them the time, and on with that kind of stuff. And back to your illustration, it's so easy to refute. Anybody can refute it. Well, okay, then take me to the woodshed in a public debate. No. I don't need to do that. No. So it's really nothing less than hypocritical for men like Doug Wilson, who is well known as a quote reformed apologist, to refuse to engage in what we have offered repeatedly now, collegial, respectful, cordial discussion of this issue. And it's so, I mean, I have seen this, and I couldn't even begin to tell you, Mike, the number of men, both within my fellowship of the Churches of Christ, amillennial world, as well as outside it, that I have challenged to formal debate. And it's the same response. Just recently, someone sent me a link to an internet page. I'd have to look it up in my files. I saved a little bit of it of an exchange that I had, but it was a couple of reformed guys, and boy, they were just tying into us, the rankest sort of heretics. And so I posted a challenge to debate, and they wrote back, "We don't debate heretics. Uh, Debate is the most arrogant form of elitism possible." And I wrote back and I said, well, that's interesting. I said, because Jesus debated the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, and the lawyers. Paul, as his custom was, went into the synagogue every Sabbath and there debated whether or not Jesus was the Christ. And I said, oh, by the way, do I have to remind you of Martin Luther and the
And not
debates that
only
he,
that, they don't have a problem debating a Jehovah Witness, a Roman Catholic, a Mormon. I think last I heard they call them damnable heretics
yep,
too.
yep,
So don't tell me that you don't debate heretics when in fact your apologists do. It's a total lie. I mean, you set the biblical groundwork for debating, but even it's just inconsistent within their own worldview and in their
I agree.
churches. They
I
know
agree.
darn well that they debate heretics.
Absolutely right. And they espouse and advocate that kind of activity because they know, as I pointed out to one individual not long ago, Christianity has advanced through debate through the centuries. The church is not today where it is as a result of not debating, of refusing to debate, to discuss, to think, to rethink. And so when men pop up so arrogantly and say, whatever you do, listen, uh, I've got to tell this little anecdote. I had a guy on the internet some years ago. It's probably been 10 years ago now. He popped up on my feed, not on Facebook, I think it was Pal Talk. You remember that?
That's a long time ago.
No,
Yeah.
that's a long time ago. Anyway, popped up on that, you're just a heretic, blah, blah, blah. And claimed to have a master's degree, claimed to be, minister of a good sized congregation. I said, well, why don't you and I have a formal public debate then? I said, you seem to think that preterism is so easy to refute, so let's debate. And he said, no, but I tell you who I'll get to debate you. I'll get Wayne Jackson to debate you. Well, Wayne Jackson at the time, and Wayne unfortunately passed away from cancer a few years ago. Super nice guy, by the way. But he said, Wayne Jackson will take you to the woodshed. Wayne Jackson, the greatest debater in the Churches of Christ. I said, point number one, I have challenged Wayne Jackson, who, by the way, I considered my friend for many, many years. He and I corresponded on a regular basis. I said, I have challenged Wayne Jackson no less than 10 times, and he refuses to debate me. So I said, but since you claim to know Wayne so well and you think you can get him to debate, you go right ahead. But here's what's going to happen. He not only is going to refuse to debate me, but he's going to tell you, whatever you do, do not debate him, because you don't know what you're getting into if you debate Don Preston. Lo and behold, the guy wrote back and told me all this. And I'm going, well, I appreciate his integrity for reporting that to me. And I said, well, okay, what about it? Are you willing to discuss these things? And he said, no, I'm going to take Wayne's advice, and our conversation is over.
Wow.
I've had that happen so many times. It's just absolutely incredible. Okay. As you and I said in our private discussions, I probably need to sit here like this to keep from having so much glare on my glasses. See what I mean? Reflection. And my wife and I were over here looking at this a while ago, trying to figure out how we can improve my lighting situation. And I really do not know how I'm going to do it, but I've got to work on it. But anyway, you and I were saying one of the passages that Doug Wilson brought forth, 2 Corinthians chapter 5. So I think since we've already touched on Romans chapter 8 for almost 2 weeks, we need to give some good attention to 2 Corinthians chapter 5, because let's face it, this is one of those passages that virtually all futurists want to run to. Look at it. It says, when we die, what's going to happen? We're going to go to heaven, and we're going to wait for the Lord to return for the judgment. And then we come back to the world, back to earth. We get our body out of the grave, none of which is said in the text, but nonetheless, that's what they claim. And so it behooves us to give some special attention to 2 Corinthians chapter 5. So, Mike, why don't you give us an overview of how you view verses 1. Let's see, that would go all the way down through verse 8, I suppose. But, just succinctly give us your overview.
Yeah, before we get into the immediate context, we need to pay attention to what scholars call an inclusio.
Yes.
We want to look at the context in which 2 Corinthians 5 sits. All right. And we go back to 2 Corinthians chapter 3, where we have the fading and the passing of the old covenant glory, present tense, while the new covenant glory is increasing. And then right after that, we have the transformation. They were being transformed into the image of Christ. And like Don has said, that was not a tissue issue. I mean, they weren't like half glowing while they were being transformed. It had nothing to do with their bodies. Okay. And Don and I are going to argue in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, this doesn't have anything to do with your physical body.
Correct.
So that's point number one. This is kind of an inclusio that starts in chapter 3, and I take it to about chapter 6, verse 16, when he's quoting Ezekiel, and he says, we are the temple. That's the corporate body. The temple, the millennial temple of Ezekiel, 36 and 37, going all the way up to Ezekiel 47. So that's really important to understand where this chapter sets. And now I guess we can get into the actual.
Well, let's follow up on that, because it is so critical, as you say. That is that's the prophetic setting for 2 Corinthians 3 through 6. And I really honestly believe that 2 Corinthians 3 through 6 is Paul's rabbinic midrash commentary. Virtually every single major constituent elements of Ezekiel 37 is found in 2 Corinthians chapters 3 through 6. And the conclusion of that midrash is chapter 7, verse 1 and 2, where he says, therefore, since we have these great and precious promises, or the one who has these great and precious promises cleanses himself of all filthiness of the flesh and of the spirit. So there's his drawing the conclusion of saying, okay, look at what has been promised to us in the past. And what has been promised in the past is, pardon me, the ministry of reconciliation between the house of Judah and the house of Israel, the 10 northern tribes, 2 southern tribes. Because in Ezekiel 37, what do you have? You have the valley of dry bones, and you have the promise that the whole house of Israel would be brought back together. The two sticks are brought together, they're bound together, and Ezekiel is told this represents the future restoration of all Israel under the Messiah. Well, guess what? In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, starting with about verse 17, Paul says, God has given unto us the ministry of reconciliation. Well, there's nothing more graphically reconciliation than Ezekiel 37, and I would also add Isaiah 49 that he draws directly from in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. Pardon me. So
Yeah.
we
Would
have,
you like me to read it?
go ahead.
Okay. For we know that if the earthly tabernacle we live in is destroyed, now this Greek word is used in Matthew 24, verse
We're going to
2.
get to that. Yeah, hang on. Yeah, we're going to get to that.
Okay. I'll just read it. We have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven. And I won't spoil the beans there, but Don did mention verse 17, where we are a new creation. And we'll look at Isaiah 65 and see if we can find out what this building is. Not built by human hands. Boy, Daniel 2 kind of pops out to me. Meanwhile, we groan. I think Don and I have spent a couple of weeks on maybe where that might be found. Let's see here. Longing to be clothed instead with our heavenly dwelling. Because when we are clothed, we will not be found naked. So that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. There's your 1 Corinthians 15 and Isaiah 25, pretty much. Now, the one who has fashioned us for this very purpose is God, who has given us the Spirit as a deposit, guaranteeing, there's our charismata that we've seen throughout 1 Corinthians, what is to come. Now, is this talking about what is to come at death, or is this talking about what comes at the eschaton at Christ's coming? And I think I'll kind of leave it there, and then we can kind of maybe unpack some of the particulars of this.
Absolutely. Pardon me. You know, early on, I've told you about starting to write a book on Romans chapter 8, running into the difficulties and being somewhat scared. But 2 Corinthians chapter 5 is one of those passages that just segues so beautifully. And, I mean, they're directly parallel passages. And I began to see the problems with 2 Corinthians chapter 5 at an early date. And I was visiting with William Bell on one occasion. Pardon me. I don't think my wife left me any water, a bottle of water over here. But anyway, William brought some insights to the table, as he almost always does, that in 2 Corinthians 5, you have the concept of nakedness and clothing that is likewise found in Ezekiel 16.
Right.
Yeah.
I found you in your blood, and
That's exactly right. And, it just boom. And it opened up all sorts of other vistas for investigation. So you mentioned a word that I want to explore that to me became definitive for rejecting the traditional view of 2 Corinthians chapter 5 as talking about the resurrection of biological bodies out of the ground and the transformation of the human physical body. So Paul says, we know that if this earthly house of this tabernacle uses oikos for house and tabernacle of skene, and both of those are obvious eschatological words. Uh, pardon me. Now, is it possible? Is it possible that Paul is using the word skene uh, to speak of the human body? Well, Peter seems to, although there's some good argument about it in Second Peter chapter 1. These things I'm writing unto you, brethren, so that you'll be aware of them, although I know that you are aware of them, but so that you will have them after my departure. For I know that I must shortly put off this tabernacle, skene. So it's possible there that he is, and I think context suggests it, by the way, that he is talking about putting off the body. I think he's talking about dying. So it's theoretically possible. We want to be objective. We want to be as honest as possible. But there's a problem with having that view in 2 Corinthians chapter 5.
Yeah.
Paul says, we know that if this earthly house of this tabernacle is dissolved, that's the good old King James, or I'm sorry, New King James. King James is dissolved. New King James is destroyed. Man, years and years and years ago, I looked at the Greek word there, and it's kataluthe. And it absolutely blew my mind. Now, a rhetorical question, a little bit of a rhetorical question, but it does demand an answer. Mike, isn't the traditional view of resurrection not the destruction of the human body, but rather the transformation of the human body? I don't really know of anybody that denies that, by the way. Doug Wilson would absolutely say, and he'd go right straight to Philippians chapter 3, where it says Christ shall transform our lowly bodies, or body, technically speaking. Well, that's a totally different word than is used right here in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. We will get to Philippians chapter 3. But when I saw that what this kataluthe actually means and how it is used in the New Testament, I was going, this doesn't fit traditional eschatology any way, shape, form, or fashion. This does not match the traditional view of resurrection, of death, burial, and resurrection of the human body in any way, shape, form, or fashion. And here's what I mean. The word kataluthe is used a good bit, by the way, in the book of Matthew. Matthew 5, 17 and 18. Jesus said, do not think that I came to destroy the law and the prophets. There's not a single translation anywhere in the world that I've ever seen, read, or heard of that translates that as, do not think that I came to transform the law. No. The fear was, and the statement was, do not think that I came to abolish, to destroy. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Well, if you translate kataluthe as destroy, if this earthly house of this tabernacle is destroyed, that doesn't fit the traditional view of eschatology at all. This word, go ahead.
I was tracking on that as well, especially in the Olivet Discourse. But then I saw that. What is your take of where Jesus says, if you destroy this temple, this body, I'll raise it up in 3 days? Is that the same Greek word?
Yes.
Okay. What is your take on that?
Well, I think it's the same. I think it's the same thing, that Jesus was acknowledging that they could destroy him. They could destroy his body if they wished. But guess what? And of course, he said that. Let's be very clear of the context. Matthew 26, what is it? Verse 41, I think. Jesus is on trial. And the Sanhedrin were looking for false prophets, or excuse me, false witnesses. They couldn't find any. Finally, they found two that came in and said, we have heard this man, Jesus of Nazareth, say, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Well, there it's referring to the physical temple. Okay. When Jesus promised to destroy his body. Let me see. Wait a minute. Which verse is that?
It's early on in one of the Gospels.
Well, in John chapter 2, verse
Yeah,
19.
I think it is John. Yeah.
Yeah. But remember, there in that context, Jesus is standing in the temple. The apostles believed that he was talking about the physical temple.
Mhm.
He said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days will raise it up. So he was talking about death there being destruction. Okay, destruction of his body. Well, obviously, they weren't able to destroy his body because it was not possible for him to see corruption. But the point being that destroy means to destroy.
Okay.
Okay. And Jesus said, you guys won't even be able to do that because of his power.
Gotcha.
And all of the other references, with the exception of one, which is translated as something like, boy, it's been a long time since I did the word study, but there's one place, I believe it's in Luke, where it says the men found lodging, and you're going, what? You're going, where did this come from? I do not understand that particular use of kataluthe. In the other passages, you've already alluded to it, Matthew chapter 24 and verse 2, Jesus being shown the stones of the temple, and he says, do you not see all of these things? The hour is coming in which not one stone shall be left standing that shall not be cast down. Obviously, destruction in mind. The passage in Matthew 26:41 that I've already alluded to, Jesus before the Sanhedrin on trial. And the false witnesses say, this man said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. The point being that the majority uses, it's very safe to say that the majority uses of kataluthe and its cognates refers to destruction. It's never used that I've been able to, and again, it's been a good little while since I actually did the in-depth linguistic analysis, but I don't remember finding a single context in which kataluthe or any of its cognates is ever used to signify any kind of a simple transformation in which you take this and you change it. No, it's always destruction. And again, it might refer to death, as in John 2, but it doesn't mean transformation. So that is an extremely, extremely powerful, in my way of thinking, argument to demonstrate that in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul's not talking about resurrection of biological bodies out of the grave.
Exactly.
And if you can't go to 2 Corinthians chapter 5 to prove a biological resurrection, you don't have 1 Thessalonians 4, and you don't have 1 Corinthians chapter 15. It's just everybody. I mean, basically, while dispensationalists might try to draw a distinction between 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and 1 Corinthians 15, nobody else does. Everybody understands these are directly parallel passages. So here is Paul using a word that essentially there's no way to linguistically challenge the meaning. And that's why the huge majority, well, all of the translations render kataluthe in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 as abolish, destroy, etc. There's not a single translation that I'm aware of, unless I missed one, unless there was a new one out there, not one of them translated as if our body is transformed. And somebody might object and say, well, no, Paul's not talking about here resurrection per se. He's talking about death. Well, while Jesus might have used that of death one time, in the rest of the cases, it doesn't mean that. Right. It means you destroy the body. Well, if you destroy the body, then it's not, then resurrection, you know, who was it that Chrysostom was arguing against in the 4th century when someone was arguing against the possibility of biological resurrection. And Chrysostom just essentially argued, well, God's great enough to do anything he wants to. He could create out of nothing, et cetera, et cetera. Well, all of that may be true, but you've got to prove it from Scripture that that was God's intent. But the argument was being made, okay, what about a person who falls overboard into the sea? The sharks, the fish consume his body. So you got 100 different fish scattering his atoms, scattering his cells here, there, and everywhere. How does God bring those back together and restore the body? And you will notice also, folks, Paul doesn't say one word in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 about restoration of the body. He says, as a matter of fact, this body is destroyed. We have a body in heaven, eternal in the heavens.
Exactly.
Which goes back, doesn't it, Mike, to one of the concepts within Judaism that we have discussed. They did not hold a monolithic, myopic view of resurrection. One of their views of resurrection was you die, you go to heaven.
Exactly.
So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and I think even Gary DeMar, one of the reasons why they're just going after him so much is that he has suggested kind of more an immortal body at death position. That some full preterists hold up. Now, if you're going to say immortal body at death only view, I would take an issue with that. I know some people say that it's both, but when I'm looking at this text, and especially 1 Corinthians 15, when we get there, there's just no way that with the tents and the seed. I mean, there's just no way. But yeah, so Gary's just being raked over the coals for just suggesting that, like you said, and he always gives the illustration of, and this was a true story, where there was an apple tree, someone was buried under the apple tree, the roots went into the coffin, pretty much sucked this guy up into the apple. People were eating the apples. So it's not just that someone's atoms and molecules are spread all over the place. It's that those atoms and molecules actually become a part of
someone
another
else
person's body.
That's right. That's right.
So, and of course they're going to say, well, God can do anything. But, once someone's atoms become someone else's atoms, I don't know. But
I've had difficulty with that for an awful long time.
Yeah. So, if Gary wants to suggest that, I mean, he's within Jewish. Now, Wilson is playing this game where he thinks he knows what the Orthodox view of the Jews were, right? So that's his way of getting out of what we're developing, and that is some Jews believed at biological death, they would be raised from their body, their spirit would go back to the Lord, and they would be judged at that time. Others said, no, we go to a waiting place, and our spirit or soul is raised out of Abraham's bosom or Hades into God's presence at the end of the age. So we have to recognize those. But the text itself, Don, when we get into the next section, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven. To me, especially where Paul is, he quotes Isaiah 65:17, just in verse 17 here. And so it's clear, we both know, when we both teach, and it's just basic hermeneutics, whenever an author quotes an Old Testament passage, you need to go to that passage in the Old Testament. You need to look at the context. Richard Hayes does this. And you have to see what kind of continuity or discontinuity the Old Testament passage is having with what Paul or whoever the New Testament author is and how they're using it. And we have so many people that are just lazy today in Christianity that don't even read their Bibles. And we have so many lazy pastors and even seminary professors that won't even train their students that this is a part of just basic hermeneutics, and they won't do it. But when we go to Isaiah 65, There's no mystery here, Don.
Mm.
What this house is that is eternal in the heavens, that's cut without hands, and that we see in Revelation actually coming down and further clothing the church. It's the New Jerusalem. This is not rocket science here.
Well, you're exactly right. It's not, but as you and I both know so very, very well, and you touched on it extremely well, we have so many people sitting in the pews today who are absolutely totally lazy when it comes to study of the Bible. People very often ask me, they say, Don, what is the greatest challenge for the spread of covenant eschatology today? And I say, number one, biblical ignorance. Number two, apathy. Number three, apathy about biblical ignorance.
Right. Whoop.
Yep. Whoop. And I really honestly think that is true. And it's frightening. You touched on it. It's frightening at the number of diplomaed preachers, quote, theologians even, that are out there that have no clue whatsoever about the things that we're saying. You know, for 19 years, I had a booth at the Abilene Christian University lectures, one of the major Church of Christ universities. And they were kind enough to let me in. I had a booth. And for the last several years, I had a big old banner hung up. Can God tell time? You can imagine the kind of interest that started there. And now, Abilene does not itself offer a doctoral program, but they do have really, really excellent master's programs. Now they may have changed that, by the way, but nonetheless, over and over and over again, these masters of divinity, master of theology, students would come by our booth. We start talking to them about resurrection, and we would ask them, well, is your hope of the resurrection based upon the Old Testament? Well, absolutely not. Oh, okay. Take them Daniel 12, verse 2. What's this talking about? Oh, wow. Quote, I never knew that was in the Bible, unquote.
Wow.
And then when you'd take them and you'd say, why don't we start reading with verse 2 or verse 1, and let's just read all the way down through verse 7. And Mike, I can't tell you the number of times these Master of Divinity students would stand there just staring at their Bible. And I've had them slam it shut, hand it back, and literally walk off without another word. Or
Wow.
say again, I did not know that was in the Bible. I'll never forget one young guy who was getting ready to graduate with his master's degree, final stages, and he goes, "Does it matter?" I said, "Wait a minute. What do you mean it doesn't matter?" And he goes, "I just don't see what it matters." I said, "Well, wait a minute." I said, "If the church is teaching that Daniel 7 or 12:7, 12:2 is yet future, and yet you see that it was full," and he pegged verse 7. I mean, boom, no issue whatsoever. I said,
Wow.
but so if the church is teaching that it's yet future, and you can see that it referred to AD 70, why doesn't that matter? He said, well, you're just trying to trick me. I said,
Yeah.
I'm not trying to trick you at all. I'm trying to show it does matter. He said, well, I don't think it matters at all. Our conversation's over. It walks off. That's what I mean about biblical ignorance being the problem and apathy being the problem, and then apathy about biblical ignorance being the key issue. And so what you and I are trying to do here, and as we both do in our separate ministries, is try to get people to think. When we approach 2 Corinthians chapter 5, just on one word, just on one word, Mike. This is how simple this is.
I know.
Any astute, logical thinking person, conversant with what the historical church has taught and still teaches, staring kata luthe squarely in the face, could say, well, I don't see a problem here. Well, maybe you don't see a problem because you don't want to see a problem.
Exactly.
I would love to know what Doug Wilson believes about kata luthe. This is a massive atom bomb placed squarely in the lap of traditional eschatology. And I have to tell you, in all of the commentaries that I have in my library, when I go to my Logos Bible study, I don't see a single commentary addressing kata luthe in any depth whatsoever. None. It's glossed over. They do the Passover on it, or they want to run down and go to Philippians chapter 3, 20 and 21. Well, what we're talking about here is the transformation. Sorry, transformation is not destruction. And so this is Doug Wilson's first problem. The second problem, as you already pointed out, if in fact, and you did this by setting the prophetic context here, if what we're dealing with in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, 3 through 5, is in fact the historical and prophetic background of Ezekiel chapter 37, I started to point out a while ago that we have the ministry of reconciliation in Ezekiel 37. We have a new covenant of peace promised in Ezekiel 37, 25 and 26. Well, 2 Corinthians chapter 3 is a new covenant. And what's that new covenant? It is of greater glory than the old. David, their king. Well, who's Paul talking about in 2 Corinthians 3 through 5 for crying out loud, except Jesus Christ, the Messiah of God? And what do we find?
Don't we have a cubed city in Ezekiel too? A cubed city temple structure?
Oh, that's exactly what we have in chapters 40 to 47. Obviously so.
So there's a house there.
There's a house there. And the closing words of Ezekiel chapter 47 say, God is with us. Oh, so you mean that's what this is all about? So when we come to 2 Corinthians chapter 6, where Paul says, do not be unequally yoked together with the unbeliever, what fellowship does light have with darkness? What fellowship does Christ have with Belial, etc., etc.? For you are the temple of God, as it is written. And he quotes, he actually conflates two verses, one from Leviticus, but the other directly from Ezekiel 37, 26. At this time of the reconciliation of Israel, which would include the nations also, according to verse 37, 26, at the time of the new covenant, at the time of the Messiah ruling, at the time of the greater glory, at the time of the transformation from death to life. Because, I mean, after all, Ezekiel 37, valley of dry bones, they stand up, the Spirit of the Lord is breathed into them, and they live. Resurrection. All of that's in 2 Corinthians 3 through 5, 3 through 6. And Ezekiel 37, 26 or 37 closes with the promise of the new tabernacle. At that time, I will set my tabernacle, skene in the Septuagint, among them. I will dwell among them. They will be my people, and I will be their God, so that all nations may know that I am with you. Here's the glorification of the God of Israel through calling of the Gentiles, reunification, the restoration of Israel, Messiah, new covenant, resurrection. It's all there. And there's not one word in Ezekiel 37 about biological death or resurrection.
Absolutely right. Also, we could probably tie in the covenantal contrast with 2 Corinthians 3 and going into Hebrews 9 and 10, where the author is saying that the first covenant, the old covenant, and the first compartment of the temple tabernacle structure, which is the holy place, was typological of their then present old covenant age. And then he says, and when the first is removed, and a lot of people and a lot of preterists think that that is the first old covenant temple completely gone. I don't understand it that way.
No.
He's talking about that first holy place part of the temple. When that is removed, then we're in God's presence. And that is exactly what we see in Revelation 21, verse 16. You have this perfect cube, which is now God's dwelling place for his people, where he's going to dwell in them and they are going to dwell in him. It's coming down from heaven. It arrives on earth, clothes God's people who are on earth. They're not raptured, Ed Stevens. And it is like a beautiful wedding garment. You know, Isaiah 52, Isaiah, was it 60 as well, the wedding garment theme. And so the church is clothed with his righteousness, and the church becomes this perfect, most holy place where they experience God's presence. And that falls perfectly with Hebrews chapter 10. And that is going to take place when he comes in a very, very little while and will not delay.
Absolutely. Good summary there, because it's, I marvel at times. I find myself sitting here day after day, and I'll be studying, I'll be researching, I'll be writing, and I will stumble on to some symmetry, as I call it, that I have not seen before. And I just literally sit back and marvel at the glory of God revealed in his word.
Yeah. The consistency and the harmony is beautiful.
It truly is. And I marvel at men, well, like Mark Smith that I debated recently, who have such a naive, uneducated, I'll use the word ignorant because that's what it is. And I was ignorant for many years. I'm real sure that there's things right now I'm still ignorant on. I learn stuff every single day. But the point of fact is, he obviously has made no effort to eliminate his ignorance. He ran into what he perceived was an insurmountable problem, what I call the challenge of Christ. Jesus said, if I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me. Mark Smith and atheists say, well, see, Jesus said he was coming back. And after all, if you go out on the streets of New York City and you say, here, somebody read this for me, okay, they'll know what that means, as if the average New Yorker would have the slightest clue what he was reading in the first place. But the point being that there is such a marvelous, marvelous unity in the scriptures, this symmetry that flows from book to book to book to book. And I love what Richard Hayes does. Now, I don't always agree with Richard Hayes. One of his books, Looking Backwards, is a book in which he says that the original intent or the original context is being changed by the New Testament writer. I don't agree with that. I think what the New Testament writers are doing, as 2 Peter chapter 1, 10 to 12 points out very well, is the New Testament writers through the Holy Spirit were giving the genuine, true meaning of what those Old Testament prophets were writing. The Old Testament prophets did not know when or how of what the things that they were predicting were to be fulfilled. And one of the massive, go ahead.
That's why the Holy Spirit was given to them through the charismata to confirm the church. Christ had bestowed and endowed the early church with the Holy Spirit, having the mind of Christ, so that they could look into the Word of God as a mirror. And James kind of even says that the Word of the Old Testament was a mirror. They were looking in it dimly, seeing God's face in what they were becoming, right? But the Holy Spirit is giving them the correct interpretation of how the Old Testament scriptures prophesied of Christ, and then how the church was the fulfillment of all these in the land, temple, city promises. And the Jews had a concept of that, Don. They did understand that when Messiah would come, he would recapitulate her redemptive history. So it wasn't completely new. I mean, there was some structure there. Even some of them believed that the Messiah, when he would come upon the clouds, that's Yahweh. That's the Messiah in some sense has got to be God. So all of these things were already there, but Jesus and the Holy Spirit endowing and gifting the church to interpret Torah just put it all the pieces together perfectly. And so it was this constant, who are the children of God during the transformation period? And you've got the rabbis with their hyperliteralism, and then you've got these dumb fishermen who are saying, well, this is the interpretation of Torah. Oh yeah, you're just a dumb fisherman. Oh yeah, really? Well, pick up your mat and walk.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, who are you going to take as the exegete there? I'll go with that guy.
Really good point. One scholar by the name of LeRondell made the observation, and he was talking about this hermeneutic that you just laid out there. Many, many, many ancient rabbis understood that the Tanakh was to be read typologically. And listen, let's face it, Paul was almost undoubtedly a rabbi. He profited above the Jews' religion, above many his own equal. He was trained at the feet of Gamaliel, et cetera, et cetera. To say the very, very least, Paul knew the Torah. And Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and this is where I'm bothered by so much of what the signers of that letter, the positions that they take, which are so contrary to the overall view. But Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 to 10, he says it twice, that the Old Covenant events and the Old Covenant people were, unfortunately, the good King James and other translations say...
Darby even.
Yeah, exactly. It's a bad translation to have Paul saying, these things happened as examples unto us, as the King James translation says. It's not right. Richard Hayes, N.T. Wright, Peter Davidson, I think it's Peter Davidson, host of scholars, fantastic Greek scholars, say the proper translation is they, and that means the people and the events, were types of us, upon whom the end of the ages has come. Paul wasn't making this up out of thin air. Paul was speaking as a good Jewish trained student of Torah, that the Old Covenant events and people foreshadowed the time of the end. One rabbi said, as it was in the days of Moses, so shall it be in the days of Messiah. That's type and antitype, folks. Now, here's what I mean with the tragedy and getting close to time out. But Max King pointed out in 1990 in his little book entitled Old Testament Israel, New Testament Salvation. Now, very clearly, I disagree with most of the positions that Max came to in his later years prior to his fairly recent death. That little book, and I wish that I had publication rights to reprint it, because I would. It is outstanding. But he says on page 2 or maybe 3 that what has happened to traditional eschatology is that the promises that God made to Israel, and these are my words, have been Christianized. And what Max King meant by that is that the promises that were made to Israel, promises of the resurrection, promises of the kingdom, promises of forgiveness, promise of coming of the Lord, promise of judgment. These are all promises that were made to Old Covenant Israel. But Christianity has turned those into events that are to take place in fulfillment of Christian promises to be fulfilled at the end of the Christian, non-Jewish age, to fulfill, again, Christian promises. And you're just going, that's the problem. That's the problem with Doug Wilson. That's the problem of Kenneth Gentry. Kenneth Gentry objecting to the preterist take on Luke 21, verse 22, when Jesus was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and said, these be the days of vengeance in which all things that are written must be fulfilled. Kenneth Gentry says, well, preterists are just naive. They're demonstrating their ignorance of the Greek here because this is in the perfect tense. And therefore, what Jesus was saying is only those things that had already been written prior to AD 30 when he spoke, those things would be what would be fulfilled. And thus what Jesus was talking about was that all Old Testament prophecy would be fulfilled by AD 70.
And no qualifier.
No qualifier.
No qualifier. And I'll just quickly add, and I'll let you continue your thought there. Just like the resurrection of Daniel 12, there was no qualifier in his book that it was a double fulfillment.
No.
And in his Facebook page, when he was talking about the resurrection of Daniel 12, he specifically said it has nothing to do with raising of physical bodies. But then when we go to Criswell, and I raised my hand and talked to him about it, all of a sudden, out of the air, now we have a double fulfillment.
Yes.
I mean, this guy is, well, I could go on a tangent.
Yeah.
But like you said, there's no qualifier what he said. And he dug his grave when he said that.
Well, I agree 100%. So when Kenneth Gentry, and look, I've had many others as well, scholarly men say all Old Testament prophecy was fulfilled. I was in a phone conversation with John Bray years and years ago, 20 years ago. He and I used to talk quite often on the phone. And anyway, he was saying, well, he had sent me a copy of his book that had just come out, Matthew 24 Fulfilled. And I was expressing my appreciation because in the book it says all of God's Old Testament promises have been fulfilled. And I said, John, I want to know if you truly believe that. He said, well, of course I do, Don. Now, this is when he still claimed to be a futurist, right. Sort of, kind of, right. Struggling. And I said, well, John, I really appreciate that. And I said, now, follow me here. All Old Testament promises that God made to Israel are fulfilled. Is that true or false? He said, no, it's true. I believe that. I said, well, John, the Old Testament predicted the resurrection, the judgment, the coming of the Lord, the kingdom, salvation, new creation. I said, all of those are found in the Old Testament, John. Phone went totally silent. And he said, well, Don, it looks as if I have some more study to do. And that's the kind of guy he was. He was a great guy. So anyway, it's just one of those type of things that Kenneth Gentry, like you said, had trapped himself. He killed himself, destroyed his own theology. So, folks, we've gotten into 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Didn't get all that far. We got far enough, but we'll have a few more things to say about it again next week. As I've already announced, I published the video on Thursday in the place of my morning musings, and I have to process this video, and I'll get it up just as soon as possible. Mike, enjoyed being with you again, as always.
Great, man. Take care.
Good night and God bless. All right. See you later.
All right. Take care, Don.